Kia ora, I'm Gwen McClure, and today on The Detail, what an Australian sunscreen scandal means for us, why some of those sunscreens, still sold here, aren't actually the SPF they say they are, and whether our sunscreen laws go far enough to protect us.
We test what we can, but it's just the tip of the iceberg. So we definitely think there needs to be some monitoring compliance done in New Zealand to just ensure that the sunscreens consumers are buying are what they think, what they're getting, and that we don't have any more of these sunscreens that are providing low protection when you think it's very high.
Earlier this year, Australian consumer protection group Choice tested 20 sunscreens. 16 of them tested at a lower SPF than their labels claimed. And one of those was particularly bad.
There has been so much controversy surrounding sunscreens recently, and in particular a Choice article that showed that a lot of sunscreens aren't quite living up to their SPF ratings, and one of those sunscreens is ultraviolet.
The sunscreen was the worst performer in a Choice test earlier this year.
Customer favourite, the Lean Screen Mattifying Zinc Skin Screen, was called out by consumer group Choice earlier this year for falling short in its claims to be SPF 50+. It was slammed by the watchdog, which claimed when tested, Lean Screen returned an SPF of only 4.
Not only is that a huge difference, SPF 50+ versus SPF 4, but ultraviolet is also an upmarket brand. A tube of Lean Screen cost $60. Naturally, people who'd been using Lean Screen, and really any ultraviolet products, were not pleased.
What do you mean your sunscreen had SPF of 4?
This was just the beginning, though. Since then, a series of other products have been pulled off shelves.
Look, I think there is an open question around whether there could be more to come. I think the fact that there has been 5 brands pull 6 products in just under a week is a signal that there is something that's not working around the way that we're regulating and testing sunscreens.
This is all happening in Australia, but these sunscreens were sold in New Zealand too. And some of them, even the ones that brands have voluntarily pulled off shelves in Australia, are still available for us to buy. We'll get to that, but let's start at the beginning. Belinda Castles works for Consumer NZ, and she's been investigating sunscreens for about a decade. I asked her to tell me how this played out.
What Choice did, when it got that very low SPF, they thought, look, we better double check, basically. So they actually sent that particular UV sunscreen to a second lab in Europe and did a bit of a smaller test, but just to sort of check that that first result wasn't an outlier, and they pretty much got a very similar result. Then they started communicating with the company. The company defended its product claims.
We stand behind the tests we've done. We stand behind the information that we have provided to the TGA. We will comply in any way with them as needed to make sure that this is ironed out. All that to say is there is a lot of nuance to SPF testing. We have the data to support the testing results. It is on our website. I also put Lean Screen on my children, and I still would tomorrow.
But then they ended up doing their own independent testing and found that their results that they got were quite inconsistent. So they were getting some of their product that was meeting claims, but other sunscreens or, other packets of it, I suppose, weren't. So there was a real consistency issue with that ultraviolet Lean Screen SPF 50+. So then that resulted in the recall.
The results of those tests were made public today, with ultraviolet revealing Lean Screen returned inconsistent SPF data, ranging from a score of 4 to 64. That's not good enough, the company admitted in a statement, adding, "We are deeply sorry that one of our products has fallen short of the standards we pride ourselves on."
The bottom line that they've come to, which we'd agree with, is if you've got that much variation, it doesn't leave you with the confidence that you need.
So that's kind of played out. I think the original testing was a few months ago, and that recall has just happened sort of within the past few weeks, I think. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So sunscreen testing, it's quite complicated and it takes quite a long time. It can take a few months just to test one sunscreen because it's tested on human subjects. You can't just send it off to a lab and get a quick result. So there is a time factor that's, it's very slow and very expensive.
Can you give me a kind of a quick recap of how sunscreen is actually tested?
Yeah, so sunscreen's tested in a independent sunscreen testing laboratory. It's tested on people, which, everyone acknowledges isn't ideal, but that's the gold standard test we have at the moment. There needs to be 10 human subjects per sunscreen test, and they need to be of different skin types. So, ranging from fairer skin to darker skin. And basically the sunscreen is applied onto their skin. A UV lamp is shone onto their skin alongside a reference sunscreen, and then different markers are taken by the lab. So it's complicated, and the fact that it's done on humans, adds to that time and expense.
So why would different labs get different results?
So there's a few reasons. So obviously we would expect a little bit of variability within test labs because they're testing on different people, but you should expect, a similar result between labs. But unfortunately, this isn't the case. And this is also played out as well. So several years ago, we had concerns about AMA labs in America, and then down the track, they got convicted of fraud because they were actually, using dodgy results. There's been concern raised in Australia that another lab, some of their results are testing high, I suppose. So there's sort of methodology and calculation issues, but, that's still going on in the background. But the AMA story was, that was huge. I mean, AMA were testing a lot of sunscreens available in New Zealand and Australia, and they were returning really high SPFs. And then when we were testing the same sunscreen, we were getting lower ones. So, we were really pleased that the FDA took action in the end. But, it's a big country. It took the FDA and the FBI also to get involved before that conviction happened.
You said when we were doing testing, we were getting different results. Who is we? Does New Zealand do testing here at labs?
Yeah, so Consumer New Zealand, we've been testing sunscreens for years, and partly this Australian investigation is triggered because we've been getting concerning results over a long time. So every time we tested sunscreens, we found some products that weren't meeting the SPF label claims, and sometimes in the big picture of sun protection, it doesn't matter from a protection perspective. So it might be claiming SPF 50 plus, it might be getting an SPF 40. So it's still high protection, but you're not getting what you pay for. You're not getting that very high protection. So Consumer New Zealand, we have spent a lot of money over the years testing sunscreens, but it's, upwards of $5,000-$6,000 to test one sunscreen. So it's not possible to test every sunscreen in New Zealand. We haven't tested for a couple of years, but we were finding very, consistently label claims weren't being met.
What happens when those label claims aren't met? I mean, do the sunscreens get pulled off shelves?
Well, no, sometimes they have been pulled off shelves. We have laid multiple complaints with the Commerce Commission over the years, but the issue is that sometimes the sunscreen companies have their own test results to back up their claims. But one of the issues we found is that there's no requirements for a sunscreen to be tested regularly. So we found companies relying on test results from 8-9 years ago. So we don't think that's good enough because they need to be checking that their claims are still being met. In the case of the ultraviolet product, that was a zinc product, and we actually found that sometimes the zinc-based sunscreens tend to be a little bit more variable, especially when they are claiming SPF 50 plus. The sunscreen experts we've spoken to over the years, they've said it's quite challenging to formulate an SPF 50 plus sunscreen with a zinc oxide base. So it tends to be those higher SPF claims that are the ones that aren't being met.
Why does it matter if a test is 8 years old? I mean, shouldn't it just be that proven to be the SPF it is and that's the SPF? Is it a formula change? What's going on there?
Yeah, well, that's clearly what the sunscreen companies say. They say we don't think that we should have to retest if we haven't changed the formula. But we found a sunscreen many years ago that, again, was a zinc-based one, and we found it tested really low compared to its label claim. The company did some research. They're like, oh, okay, so we've got the same formula, but we've changed our zinc supply. So that impacted on the sunscreen, and they ended up recalling that sunscreen. So, if you're a sunscreen company, and, we're talking some really, really big players in the market, and they're not testing regularly, we don't think that's good enough. And I mean, when we contact these companies in New Zealand, we're finding some really small players in the market, small New Zealand companies, they are testing regularly. So, yeah, we just think that's not good enough.
Yeah, okay. We've now got the Sunscreen Product Safety Standard Act 2022. Tell me about what that is.
Okay, so it's a positive thing. So back when consumers started testing sunscreens, there was no regulation around sunscreens, basically. So anyone could make a sunscreen and sell it online, and people did. I mean, talking years and years ago, we actually tested sunscreens that were made, sold online, and came back SPFs of 4 or similar. So we had a huge issue in New Zealand. Since that Sunscreen Product Safety Act came in, there is more protections for consumers. So now sunscreens have to abide by the Act, which means they have to meet the Australian New Zealand sunscreen standard, which has requirements for independent testing and also labelling requirements as well. So we at least have some regulation, which is a lot better than we had a few years ago.
But what about enforcement? What does enforcement of this safety standard look like?
Yeah, unfortunately, there's a lot that needs to happen in this space. So there's probably very little enforcement because, there's a couple of reasons. We have, in our consumer database, we have over 150 sunscreens, and we know that's not all the sunscreens sold in New Zealand. Each sunscreen to be tested, if you wanted to monitor, is over $5,000 each. So unless there's a complaint laid with the Commerce Commission, which needs to be based on independent testing, there's very little happening in that space, which is also concerning when you consider those Australian results, when 16 out of the 20 products they tested didn't meet label claims, and many of those were available in New Zealand.
And some of them still are available here. A quick Google shows that at least 5 of the 16 that didn't meet their claims are still sold here. There's another issue too. Since the ultraviolet recall, several other brands have paused sale of products out of a concern that they might share a base formula with Sunscreen.
Some smaller sunscreen brands, well, not necessarily smaller, they will go to a contract sunscreen manufacturer. So it's possible that there's different products on the market that are actually the same sunscreen, but they're just repackaged and sold under a different brand. I'm just hypothesizing here. That's possibly what's happened. They've come from the same sunscreen manufacturer.
At least 5 different sunscreen products have been pulled from shelves over sun safety concerns, and they all have at least one thing in common. They all have the same base formula. ABC asked sunscreen experts to take a look at these paused products, and they found that all of them share the same base formula as Ultraviolet's Sunscreen. As the experts scientifically put it, it's kind of like you're at an ice cream store and these sunscreens are the same flavour with different toppings, which is things like fragrance and colour. The ABC can confirm there are at least 4 other sunscreen products that share the same base formula still on shelves.
It happens when we've tested sunscreens in the past and we've gone back to them to substantiate claims. We've got the same test reports for different products. So it's just a reality of sunscreen manufacture.
The TGA, which regulates this space, has now confirmed it's examining sunscreens with the same or similar formulation base as part of a wider investigation.
If you want a list of those, it's in the ABC article I've linked in our notes section. And you can also find a link to the Choice article to see which sunscreens have met their claims. Now, about those that share the base formula. It's important to make a distinction here. Sunscreen has been recalled, whereas other companies have voluntarily put specific products on pause while they do further testing.
The 5 which have been paused have each issued their own statement, essentially saying they're waiting on further testing on their sun protection claims. So while people can't currently buy these products, customers aren't automatically entitled to a refund because it isn't a full product recall.
But that's not exactly the case here. At least 2 of those paused products are still being sold to New Zealanders, despite brands saying sales are on hold. One of these is Aspect's Sun Physical SPF. Aspect told me they've contacted their stockists, but some of those stockists are still selling it. I called one of them, a medical clinic in Auckland, And they said they didn't know about the issue until I contacted them. 5 days after that, I followed up to ask why they were still selling it, and a few hours later, they did list it as out of stock. As for Ultraviolet, New Zealanders can buy the brand at Sephora or directly from the company's site. Lean Screen isn't available anymore on either, and Ultraviolet is offering a refund to customers regardless of where they bought the product. But I wanted to know if Sephora had contacted customers to tell them about the recall, considering that anyone who doesn't follow Ultraviolet on social media could have missed this and might be using it without knowing. Sephora declined to respond. In the case of Mecca, I asked them if they'd contacted customers who bought Naked Sunday's Collagen Glow Mineral Sunscreen, one of the others with that shared base formula. They told me they had contacted the customers in their database who'd recently bought it and updated the brand's page on their site with a statement.
It's not just the fact that it's being sold currently, it's that, I might have bought that product last week. So, yeah, and especially the Sephoras and the Meccas and those types of retailers, you would assume that quite a lot of people that purchase from there are loyalty card members. So, sending an email to those people that have bought it would be a good customer service act, I would have thought.
Yes, I agree. But is it just customer service or is it the
No,
law?
you're right. It should. If the product's not doing what it's supposed to, if those products are concerned that their SPF claim is SPF 4, if it is the same formula as the Ultraviolet Lean Screen that's been in question, then consumers should totally be able to return that product and get a refund.
I also came across the product safety.gov.nz recalls list to see if any of these were on the recalls list. So I didn't see any of these products on there, but there was a recall for a bunch of sunscreens. I think it was about 30 sunscreens that were sold at Harvey Norman. And these were on that list because of labeling. So there will be a recall issued if things are not labeled properly?
Yeah, so the Australian New Zealand sunscreen standard has requirements for labelling, which includes having adequate information about how to apply the product. So that's that, apply regularly, apply generously, all that types of stuff. So when that law came into effect, there'll be a lot of sunscreens out there that didn't meet those requirements. So the majority of the products on that list are possibly there because of a labelling requirement. But that is a different issue to the sunscreens that aren't protecting your skin.
I do think it's interesting that something being labeled in a way that doesn't comply with the act, so, they're not telling you to put on enough or whatever it is sort of seen as a bigger deal and deserves a recall when something that's actually just completely misleading, labeled as an SPF 50 when it's a 4, for example, doesn't hit that list. Is that weird?
Well, yeah, it's clearly not right. But I think the issue with the sunscreen testing is the company, UV, for example, obviously had its own supporting test results to back up its claim from an independent lab. So then it had to go through their process of investigating that. If Choice hadn't tested that particular product, and I'm not sure exactly how they picked the products they were going to test, then none of this would have even come to light. And the company would have unknowingly been selling that product because they had the test results to back it up. So that's where the other issue of who is monitoring the testing laboratories is coming into play as well.
Okay.
So it's really complicated because it's when we tested sunscreens a couple of years ago, we went to a huge expense of testing at 2 different labs because consumer would have one set of test results, the company would have their own, which did back up their claim. So we would say, well, actually, hey, we've got 2 sets of test results, and that was a huge expense for us, but we thought it was really important because otherwise you get a bit of a stalemate. And you have to give Ultraviolet its due for doing more testing and then discovering that, hey, we've got some real inconsistency issues here. Yeah, it's a long process, unfortunately.
I think on your website, it said that you're not doing testing this summer and that's linked to this new law from 2022. Is that right?
So we tested in 2022 was the last time we tested. Since then, we've developed a sunscreens database. So we've gone out to every sunscreen company and retailer that we can find in New Zealand and asked them about what sunscreens they're selling, what's in them, what their claims are. But part of that, we've asked them where, at what testing laboratory and when their sunscreen was tested. And we've put a lot of that information on our website. So, I want to know that if I'm buying a sunscreen, it wasn't tested 8 years ago.
Right, okay.
So we've got all that information on there if consumers want to drill down to that. And they can also filter by price as well, because as we were saying, sunscreens, if you're using them a lot, are expensive. So we've got a lot of sunscreen information up there about the testing, when and where. We've also, it's really disappointing, some of the big players in the sunscreen market, the Neutrogenas, the Niveas, the Banana Boats, they have refused to provide that information to us. So we think that lack of transparency isn't good enough either. I mean, they have to be testing under the standard. We know they will be, but they won't share that information. So what are they hiding? Are their test results 7, 8, 9 years old? We just don't know. So that database is really useful if you want to drill down into lots of the sunscreens that are sold in New Zealand.
Sometimes some of those Niveas, those Banana Boats that you're talking about in the past have not met the SPF claims though, right? Under consumers testing?
Yeah, that's correct. We were consistently finding those brands not meeting their claims, but they weren't the shock, gee, they're only SPF 4. They were sort of claiming 50 plus, but getting in the 40s. Banana Boat used to often test in the 30s. So they actually they're still going to provide protection. So it's not such an issue. But under a fair trading perspective, they're not providing the protection that they claim.
Obviously, you've got this database that people can go to, but what else should consumers be looking for? What should I be looking for so I can trust the brand that I'm buying it from?
Okay, so it's really important that this news that's come out of Australia about the testing doesn't put people off using sunscreen, because we know sunscreen works. We know it's really important to be using it properly. And we know that New Zealand has one of the highest rates of skin cancer and melanoma in the world. So sun protection is super important as we're coming into summer. But, from our perspective, we've got this database. You can check out when and where companies were testing their sunscreens. Look for the ones that are transparent. We've got a list of the products that their test results, the Australian test results on our website too, so you can check those out. There's some brands there that did meet their label claims. So, yeah, just wear sunscreen, please, and protect your skin.
That's all for today. The Detail is a newsroom production supported by RNZ and New Zealand On Air. This episode was produced by Alexia Russell and engineered by William Saunders. Thanks to Belinda Castles for talking to me, Gwen McClure. Ka kite anō.